Age of Change. Chapter 6. A Tough Victory. The quick jab to the face made the shadow goblin's eyes water, and with the pain that came with the jab the goblin fully woke up from its daze. Just as it was about to move to protect itself, I kicked out clumsily to its stomach, which sent it back a couple feet into the sun. Through all my actions the goblin was hardly injured, but it was better than nothing. The goblin then numbly landed on its feet again, but April wasn't going to let the goblin have any breaks. As she ran up to the goblin, she swung her modified club aiming for its head. Just as it was about to land, the goblin put both its arms up to block the blow. Bam! The club landed with fury. The goblin was sent flying 2 meters back, but like always it nimbly landed on its feet. I hate to admit this, but the shadow goblin has an amazing sense of balance that would make anyone jealous. While the goblin was shaking off the damage, I looked at how much damage we did overall. Silver, Shadow Goblin. Level, 7. Health, 189, 250. Through all the damage me and April did to the goblin, its health was going down extremely slow, but on the bright side, we were chipping away at its life chip by chip. As long as we didn't let any mishaps happen, we would be in the green. I bent down to pick up my fallen club, then tightened my hold on the club, waiting for the goblin to attack. I didn't have to wait for long, as the goblin had already stabilized itself. There was one thing I noticed about the goblin: it was noticeably tired. The daggers in its hand didn't seem to be heavy, and it was still nimble. The only thing I could think affected its stamina was the instantaneous attack it landed on me. This was extremely good news, but it also made me worry. If the goblin could use its skill a couple more times, I would probably die. The goblin was specifically targeting me, and now I was losing blood. I don't think I would be able to block the skill a second time. The goblin growled while waiting for us to show any openings. No one moved for a good 10 seconds. I couldn't take the wait anymore, and I was starting to get woozy. April looked at me with worry in her eyes, and saw that I was getting impatient. Cover me while I attack, and don't lose your cool. We'll end the fight as quick as possible, so we could bandage you up, but remember, don't lose your cool. I nodded to show her that I understood her plan. I took in a deep breath to regulate my breathing. I pushed down my impatience and tried to block out the pain. After doing this, I started to concentrate on the fight to come. April calmly started to walk up to the shadow goblin. As soon as she reached a meter from the goblin, she lunged while aiming for the goblin's waist. The goblin seen the attack coming from a mile away. The goblin jumped up in the air to avoid the attack. The attack missed the goblin, but that was when I threw my club. The club came whizzing at the goblin's stomach. The goblin couldn't move in the air, so it tightened its stomach while bringing its arms down to block the blow. What no one saw coming was that the goblin put more force in its jump than it wanted to, which made the next moment hell on earth for it. The club a fraction of a second later hit the goblin square in its genitals. I could have sworn I heard a disgusting crack coming from the goblin's private part. The sound made me cringe from the bottom of my soul. The goblin spat out a glob of blood on its way down. This time the goblin didn't land on its feet, it fell on its back with a hard thump. Out of the goblin's mouth came a blood-curdling shrill scream. I subconsciously brought my hands down to cover up my private part. For the first time in my life, I felt extreme pity for someone else, and I felt extremely bad for what I did. I wouldn't wish for this to happen to my worst enemy. I looked over to April to see her body shaking a bit. I see where her eyes were looking to see blood coming out the shadow goblin's genitals. My body once more cringed at the sight of the blood. I couldn't imagine the amount of pain the goblin was going through, and I didn't want to. My cut seemed petty compared to what happened to the goblin. When April's body stopped shaking, she turned to me, and I saw the resoluteness to end this in her eyes. She tightened her hold of her club, walked to the goblin, aimed the club at the goblin's head, and down came the club. The goblin raised one of its hands up to block the blow. The goblin was slightly successful, but the blow slightly landed on its head. April was somewhat disappointed at the outcome, but didn't let it faze her too much. She raised up her club for the next blow. She used all the strength she could muster on the club's way down. The goblin didn't want to die without getting revenge on me. Before April's hit could land, the shadow goblin stopped feeling pity for itself, homed in its hatred for me, and started to roll. Even though the goblin rolled, it didn't fully escape the range of the attack. April's attack landed on the right side of the goblin's head. Lucky for the goblin, the blow didn't end its life since it only nicked its head a bit. The shadow goblin got on its feet and escaped from April's range. The goblin looked at me with pure malice in its eyes. If looks could kill, I would be dead 10 times over. While looking at me, the shadow goblin brought its hand over to its head. While bringing its hands down, it saw its blood. Staring at its blood, it turned to glare at April but quickly turned back to me. I felt an unbelievable amount of pressure from the goblin's body. From this I knew I was in trouble. I had no weapon in my hands to potentially block the next attack. Even with all this, I had no fear in my eyes. I was ready for what was next to come. April saw what was happening, and she knew what the goblin was going to do next. She put her foot down, getting ready to sprint in my direction. Before she could even run, the goblin disappeared to only reappear a fraction of a second later in front of me. I was already ready for this attack, so I had planted my feet earlier, hoping to jump back out of the range of the attack. I wasn't successful since the shadow goblin appeared very close to my guard. As soon as the goblin reached me, it struck out with its dagger. To my horror, the goblin wasn't aiming at my heart, but somewhere that was extremely vindictive, my genitals. I have never been so scared in my life. I was so scarred, I tried so hard to make my body move out of the dagger's path. I almost felt something in my back rip, but I didn't pay attention since by the will of God my body turned enough for the dagger to stab into my leg. I wanted to cry out in pain but held it in. I fell to the ground hard but kept my head up, so I didn't hit the ground. In doing so, I escaped getting a concussion. The goblin looked at me with a slight reluctance in its eyes. It knew that this was its only chance to escape into the shadows. Looking at me one more time, the goblin started to run. Before it could go anywhere far, I reached out and caught its leg in mid-stride. The shadow goblin fell down to the ground, looking at the shade with longing that would never come. The goblin turned on its back to face me in its last moments. I ignored the pain coming from the dagger stuck in my leg and pulled the goblin towards me. I ignored the blood coming out of the goblin and crawled on top of it. While on top of the goblin, I started to punch with all the resentment this fight gave me. The shadow goblin brought its hands up to block my punches to the best of its ability, but it was badly injured and beyond tired. My punches were landing on its guard until it had no more energy to protect itself. If I had looked down, I would see the goblin had tears running down its face, and the unwillingness to die in its eyes. My mind didn't recognize anything other than my rage and resentment. Even if I did see what was happening, I would still kill the shadow goblin. Punch after punch after punch landed on the goblin's face until it started to get bloody. I didn't care. I kept on going and going, punch after punch after punch, until I heard a sound in my head followed by another notification. Silver Shadow Goblin is dead. Level up. Even after the 2 notifications, I kept on punching and punching until April pulled me off the shadow goblin's body. Tears started to come out of my eyes. I was so happy to be alive that I didn't care if April saw me crying. This was the most dangerous fight I had in my life. I had a semi-deep cut on my chest just above my nipples and a dagger stuck in my leg. I also had a possible injury to my back from turning at the shadow goblin's attack to my family jewels. Crying helped relieve all my pent-up destructive emotions, and it wouldn't matter who saw me in this moment, I would still cry. It's all over now, so let it all out, said April. I turned to her and nodded. I looked at the sky and roared, letting out every bad emotion I had at this moment. April patted my back to give me encouragement and laughed in the process. If you're done, let's go get your wounds cleaned. Thanks for watching. If you like the content, like and subscribe.